There are a couple of things I haven't really talked about before that I don't want to forget to cover. Why I chose this particular car. In America, most cars are fairly heavy. We love our SUVs here, not a really good candidate. When you're doing an electric vehicle, you want to choose the type of car you would choose if you want to get a car that gets good gas mileage. You want a car that's as lightweight as possible, but it still has to be able to carry all the weight that you're going to add to it. And you want to choose a car that's fairly aerodynamic. Obviously, one of the big reasons I chose this particular car was because it was in such good shape. I didn't have to do any mechanical work to the brakes or transmission, don't have to do any body work, any of that sort of thing. Because remember, I'm not going to have a gas motor and all those components that can wear out. An electric motor will actually last a very long time. While I will every now and then, I'm hoping between 3 and 5 years, have to replace the battery pack, the electric components themselves should easily last the life of this car. So I wanted to pick a vehicle that was in good shape and was going to last me a long time as well. Now, this particular car, for an American car, is pretty lightweight. It weighs just under 2,500 pounds. It has a pretty low drag coefficient, so it's very aerodynamic. And it has room in the trunk, room in the engine compartment for batteries, so it's a pretty good candidate overall. Now remember, there are a couple things that you're going to be missing when you take out this engine here. Now, one of the things is that the passenger side drive axle bolts directly to the block of the motor. Well, you're not going to have that motor there to hold that axle up. So you're going to have to fabricate something to hold that axle right where it is now so that everything still works properly. And you want to take a couple measurements. I talked a little bit about ride height before, but we also want to measure the axles, the transmission, and make sure that those components, when we put it all back together, are in exactly the same position they are now. I basically cut a piece of wood that would fit between these two fenders right here, not scratch the paint in any way, and then I also marked it for exactly where I place it when I take my measurements. That way there's no confusion later as to whether it was here or there, and I know exactly what I'm going to do. Now, one of the things I've done is I've marked the spot that I measured from, and I go straight down to the drive axle. I wrote exactly what that measurement is. That tells me that's exactly the height that that axle needs to be placed when everything's done. I also mark right here that I set it right on top of these rubber bumpers, and I measure the top of the transmission. Because again, the transmission needs to be in exactly the same place. That's not going to be too hard with here because the engine mounts actually bolt to the transmission. But I still want to make sure I have all of those measurements. Now, once that engine block is completely removed, there's one other very critical number. I need to measure exactly how far I have from the edge of the bell housing and the drive shaft in there, and how much space I need to put between there when I mount the motor, so that the shaft from the motor, the shaft from the bell housing, both meet up and there'll be a coupler in between. Now, I'm actually going to dispense with the clutch. Some people keep the clutch, some people get rid of the clutch. When you don't have a gas motor idling, you don't need a clutch. And as most people know, if you're driving a stick, you can get used to where to shift without having to put the clutch in anyway. Well, it's so much easier with an electric motor because, again, you don't have a motor sitting there idling. And one of the other reasons I chose this particular car is when I very first test drive it, I realized that you can actually shift gears, all of the gears, very easily without using the clutch. So this is going to be a pretty good donor, and I'm being careful to take all my measurements so that hopefully when we put it all back together, I'll have a lot less problems putting it together than I'm having tearing it apart. Just wanted to make sure we covered those items. Okay, I've removed the drive axles. One of the things I did was tie up the brake caliper so that it's not hanging by the brake line, and then of course tie up the whole assembly over here so that it's not just dangling off the car. And once the motor mounts are released, then we're ready to take the engine out. There's just a couple more parts left to do. You can see over here that the drive axles are all removed, and the motor mounts are pretty much all taken out, and we're just ready for the hoist and pull that sucker out of there. Okay, I had to bring you along for what is a very momentous event. This sucker is completely unattached, it's completely above the car, and out it came. You know, it took me many hours to get to this point to be able to pull it out, but the actual unbolting the engine mounts, pulling it out of the engine, 10 minutes. It was the easiest part of the whole process. And you have to remember that I am in no ways a mechanic. I have never attempted anything this involved. I've taken the axles out, I've taken the wheel assemblies apart to get the axles out, everything removed from this engine, and up it comes. I've already removed 300 pounds from this car. I don't know exactly how much the block and head weigh, but I'm going to weigh that before I set it all down as well. And then I'll have to subtract the weight of the transmission later. But I just wanted to make sure everybody's here to see this sucker come out. Then I'm going to clean all of this out inside, and it's going to look beautiful and very clean for my future EV. Thanks for sticking with me.